Hi guys, and welcome to Mrs. B Teaches English. Today we are looking at the poem Garden of Love by William Blake. The Garden of Love is part of a collection that Blake illustrated himself. It was typical of him to look at the innocence of childhood and how it was tainted by life experience. He used images of children, flowers, and animals in simple rhymes and rhythms to depict innocence while criticizing state or church control. The Garden of Love is a poem mostly written in anger towards the church. It represents something or someone that has been destroyed or taken from Blake, or someone else because of the church. In this poem, Blake may be attacking a new chapel built in Lambeth, his then near home, in which parishioners paid for their pews. Blake was appalled by the idea that those who could not pay would be excluded from Christianity's Garden of Love. Let's take a look at Blake himself. So, William Blake was born in London in 1757. He left school at the age of 10 years old and became an apprentice to a printmaker where he became an engraver. He illustrated a lot of his own poetry books. The Garden of Love was published as part of his collection Songs of Experience. Blake was not popular amongst the church authorities of his time, as they viewed his questioning of organized religion as rebellious, and then he passed away in 1827. Now, William Blake forms part of a movement in poetry called romanticism. It's not only limited to poetry, there were also romantic writers of novels like Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. The romanticism was an artistic, literary, and intellectual movement originated in Europe towards the end of the 18th century, and the focus was really on emotion and individualism, and it celebrated the nature and the past. We commonly think of the most famous romantic poets as Blake, William Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, Percy Shelley, and they really believed that their art could transform the world and regenerate people spiritually. Blake in particular was radical in his political and spiritual ideas, speaking out against the monarchy and the church, which of course did not make him very popular with these entities. Now, before we start reading, I want to ask you 3 questions that perhaps you can just pause and think about. Why do people like gardens? And what do you think is the most famous historical garden of all? And then, do you feel that the world perhaps loses its innocence as you get older? And why do you say this? Perhaps you can just pause and think a little bit before we read. And then, if you're ready, let's continue. The Garden of Love. I went to the Garden of Love and saw what I never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst, where I used to play on the green. And the gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not writ over the door. So I turned to the Garden of Love, that so many sweet flowers bore. And I saw it was filled with graves, and tombstones where flowers should be. And priests in black gowns were walking their rounds, and binding with briars my joys and desires. So, looking at the structure of this poem, you will notice that there are 3 stanzas of 4 lines each, and each focuses on different issues. In the first stanza, it focuses on the speaker's discovery of this chapel. Then the second stanza moves on to the speaker's feelings about this building, and he expresses hope for consolation to be found in this garden. In the third stanza, the speaker expresses disappointment that this too has undergone drastic change. And then we notice that there are end rhymes in the first 2 stanzas. So we have A, B, C, B, D, E, F, E. And then we also find internal rhyme with words like gowns and rounds, briars and desires. If we were to analyze the diction, you will notice that Blake really uses very simple and straightforward language, which is characteristic of the Romantic movement. in capturing natural expression of the speaker's experience. He doesn't want to make it very complicated. He wants to express this idea very simply and very straightforward so that everybody can understand. He uses the first person, and he also uses the word never. Both of these concepts emphasize the frustration that he has with the church because it makes it very personal, and he uses this absolute of never to emphasize the frustration. The simple language and the simple structure really support each other in emphasizing the message that Blake seeks to put forward. Now, looking at the title, Garden of Love, it really makes us think of perhaps this Eden or paradise. It makes us think of innocence, of the childhood, Garden of Love. And then, of course, it refers to an allegorical satire in which Blake is criticizing the Church of England. So we can say that this poem describes the speaker's discovery that his childhood playing field, or this garden or park of happy memories, is now dominated by a church. And he comes to the garden and sees it has been changed from how he perceived it in his youth. Where there once was green grass and natural beauty, there is now a man-made chapel. And he understands that the carefree life he had as a child is now a church in the center of it. The church now dominates and controls his life. So we're going to jump into the line-by-line analysis. And stanza 1, just a summary of it really. The speaker describes revisiting a place he remembers from his childhood, only to find that it has been taken over by a chapel or a church. So Blake says, I went to the Garden of Love and saw what I never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst where I used to play on the green. The first image in this poem really sounds like a memory of a boy or perhaps a girl at play in a park, a pleasurable memory, now disturbed by the inclusion of a little church right in the middle of the playground. The past tense is used to play, and it sounds like all the fun is now past. This means that the speaker is now an adult. There's a contrast with youth and its associations of joy and innocence and maturity, and the association with knowledge and experience, which is very significant in this poem. The speaker also uses the first person because he is relating a very personal experience. In terms of punctuation, Blake capitalizes the words garden and love to convey the significance of their association beyond the simple memory of play in a favorite park. Garden reminds us of the biblical Garden of Eden, where everything was innocent until evil corrupted good. This is ironic considering that the church is accused here of removing the innocence. The use of the word midst really shows the poet's resentment that the chapel has been imposed on the green. A green here, the use of the word green refers to a public or common park. And then the tenses, the use of the past tense emphasizes the passing of time, implying that the speaker has only just perhaps realized what has always been in front of him, but he hadn't taken note of it, namely the harsh repression of replacing natural pleasure. Then also just paying attention to the choice of the word green. Besides a green being this place of freedom and play, the color green is associated with growth, fertility, and spring, adding to the idea of play. Traditionally, village greens were not owned by anyone, so represented freedom from the rule of demands of any authority figure. Overall, we have a tone of shock in stanza 1. The speaker is shocked to see that this place that he associated with joy and innocence has now disappeared and has been replaced with this little church. Stanza 2, the summary then, he is prevented from entering, so he attempts to explore the surrounding garden instead. The place which used to be full of sweet flowers has been filled with graves and tombstones instead. He says, "And the gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not writ over the door. So I turned to the garden of love, that so many sweet flowers bore." The speaker looks at the chapel and sees that its gates are closed and there is "thou shalt not" written on its door. This conveys the idea that the church doesn't welcome anyone who doesn't want to live by its rules. It doesn't want to welcome those hearts that are still full of joy of life. It seems that the church demands obedience of the rules it has made for us and condemns everyone who wants to live by their own terms. So, organized religion is intentionally preventing people from enjoying desire and pleasure. The words "were shut" means that it is physically keeping the people out. Then "thou shalt not" is of course an allusion to the 10 Commandments. It's the opening words of 7 of those 10 commandments in the Christian Bible. This biblical connotation then reminds us of the connotation to the Garden of Eden, and also the words "thou shalt not" remain here after the original sin. Then again we notice the punctuation, the word chapel, garden, and love is capitalized, which gives the small church importance to the speaker. The capital letters and full stop in "thou shalt not" highlight this commandment as unfriendly and hostile. And again we have the past tense in line 8. Sweet flowers are no longer there, bore. It no longer bears these sweet flowers. We also find the anaphora of and, adding to the negative imagery of the church in line 5 and 6. So basically here we find that Blake is saying institutionalized religion destroyed his garden of love. We notice that he says the gates were shut, meaning also that the people are not free to act or be themselves. And then a last note is on the monosyllabic words in the stanza. These words really make the commandment sound even harsher. Thou shalt not. They each consist of one syllable. Using this forceful long sounds in the monosyllabic archaic words that almost shock the speaker out of his daydream of things that are past. And all of this is considered to be extremely ironic, as we usually think of a church as a place that will allow people in and that will attract followers rather than keeping them out. Stanza 3 then, the summary. Patrolling priests in dark robes prevent him from experiencing or reliving his joys and desires. He rebels against the idea of the original sin and believes that love should not be sanctified by religion. Blake says, "And I saw it was filled with graves and tombstones where flowers should be, and priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires." The speaker finds a graveyard where there once were flowers, and a move from life to death that the poet emphasizes with the colors green for life and then black for death. Here, a normal and even peaceful idea of priests praying on the church grounds is given a rather ominous connotation. The black gowns seem sinister, while the priests sound like guards keeping watch for undesirables, meaning people that are not following the rules. It emphasizes the lack of freedom. The idea of graves and tombstones are really negative imagery of death overshadowing where life should be, showing that there should be flowers. Clearly, some adverse changes have taken place. Joy and flowers are forbidden by this church. The dreams lie under the weight of their tombstones. Blake then turns to the idea of the priests in their black gowns that were walking their rounds. The capital letter in priests echoes the capitalization of Garden of Love. These members dominate this space now. The color black is also associated with death and restriction. The only other color in this poem is green. Thus, life and vitality seem to be in direct contrast with death. And the priests are walking their rounds. This really gives the impression that they are doing this out of routine, and it's methodical rather than sincere. This description overall reveals the austerity or the strictness and unapproachability of the priests and the church as a whole. Instead of spreading joy, love, and acceptance, they spread depression, diversity, and gloom. In this final stanza, we find again that the poet uses anaphora, this deliberate repetition of the word and at the beginning of the line, emphasizing the nature and decay at the hands of the church, which does not care for it. In the final line, we find that he says, "And binding with briars my joys and desires." Of course, there's both alliteration here of the B sound, the harsh B sound, which reminds us of the painful experience that the speaker is going through, and of course the painful Christ-like image of the thorns. He blames the church for suppressing any pleasure he has had in his life. As a side note, we also notice the use of the ampersand and here instead of writing it out. This is really unusual for classic poets to use, and it really shows how ahead of time Blake was in his writing. Finally, we can say that he expresses this tone of anger or disappointment and outrage of what has been taken from him, but he implies it through color, allusion, diction, and imagery, instead of just saying it outright that he's angry at the church for taking away this idea of innocence from his life, for taking away the idea of natural pleasure, and for restricting his freedom. We're now going to look at some structural ideas that we find in the poem. So the first one is tone. Overall, in this poem, the tone can be described as nostalgic for former times and dismayed at how organized religion has encroached on the personal freedoms of people. We also notice some contrast throughout the poem. We have the idea of green versus black, which then, of course, is tied up with the idea of life versus death and innocence versus maturity. We also have flowers versus thorny briars. And then playing freely in the park versus the priests doing their rounds out of routine and method. We have nature, the park, versus man-made objects, the chapel. Growth, again associated with the green and life versus lifelessness, death, the tombstones, and the black color that is being used. Gentleness versus pain. Again, binding with briars my joys and desires versus the gentleness of being young and being able to play freely. Light versus dark. Freedom versus restriction. So that freedom that comes with youth and then the restriction that is imposed by the state and the church and their rules. Ultimately, we can say that Blake is not really against the church and religion. He is against the rules that it is imposing and the fact that it is keeping people away with these rules and restrictions instead of allowing people to enter. Then there are some main themes that we identify, and that is the passing of time. Of course, he is returning after a period of time to the garden, and he notices that it has changed. And then the curbing of pleasure and freedom by organized religion. All of these rules is curbing or restricting our pleasure, he says. Then there's a concept of loss of childhood innocence due to prescribed religious parameters that is expressed by the speaker. And those are the main themes that we really encounter. Of course, there's also a theme of life versus death that we see that plays a role. Then intention. Blake really wants to criticize organized religion with this poem, and especially the church, how the church restricts the lives of people with its rules. He argues that people should embrace love instead of all of these restrictions. Then, of course, we can interpret this poem on two levels. On one level, it is quite simply a mark of passage of time, and it is the result of human expansion and the open area of childhood that no longer exists. So we can say it's about a poem. It's a poem about a garden that has been replaced with a church. However, we can also say that it's on a deeper level a poem about restriction of freedom and freedom of expression and freedom from enjoying pleasures in life. And that is done by this institution, this church, that says that if you do not obey all our rules, you are not welcome. So basically, those are the two interpretations that this poem covers. Sound devices. We said before that the Romantics were known for simple language and simple rhyme and rhythm, and that's really what we see here. There's a regular, steady meter and rhyming. However, the change in the rhyme and pace in the last two lines gets our attention to what the message of this poem really is. Perhaps the speaker suggests that his world is now out of balance with his realization, and this new reality requires a different form and expression, and that is why he changes it up a little in the last stanza. Then the mood, how we feel when we read this poem. There's this use of the color black and the flowers and the tombstones, and all of this really gives the poem a somber, malevolent and oppressive mood. When we read it, we really do feel oppressed with him, and we feel dark and gloomy reading about all of this restriction of freedom and the disappointment that the speaker experienced. So just to summarize, this is really a poem about a personal experience that the speaker had, in which he quite literally expresses his outrage over a park that has now been imposed on by a church, and it has changed a place that he used to play in freely. It has changed his childhood memories. But on a deeper level, the poet is trying to comment on a social structure in life in which he says that he does not agree with all of the restrictions that the church is placing on expression of life and desire and pleasure and also religion. He does not agree that the church is keeping people out that refuse to follow certain sets of rules, because perhaps he feels that there is more to life and the way of expressing ourselves. And of course, the church did not look upon him very favorably for expressing this criticism. Ultimately, we cannot say that he is criticizing religion as such, but that he is criticizing the institution that comes with organized religion.